as I see again, like I said, 20 plus million developers. And how many do we have on the blockchain stack? A very small number, right? Very small number. But we know how it goes, right? Early days of cloud, I remember. I mean, people were saying, look, it's just storage, it's just compute, it's just archival and backup, and see where we are, 15 years later. And so I see, obviously, the movie. The way I tell people is, the trailer is playing in the theater, but the movie is not there yet, right? And looking at the trailer, it's hard to say, is this a successful domain or industry or not, because it's just the trailer.
Hi, it's Conor Svensson here, founder and CEO at Web3 Labs. This is a conversation I had with John deVadoss, Head of Development at Neo Blockchain. John spent the first couple of decades of his career working at Microsoft, where he worked on a number of key platform initiatives, including their .NET platform. In our discussion, we covered a number of topics, including why decentralisation is merely an enabler for self-governance and self-sovereignty, blockchains as economic platforms, how the intersection of technology, economics and social issues is driving Web3 adoption, and how early we still are in the overall adoption of Web3. I've known John for a number of years now, and it's always great to catch up with him, given his experience and perspectives, and I'm sure you'll enjoy our chat. John, it's great to have you here today on the podcast.
Hello, Connor. It's very good to see you, my friend. It's been a long time. I think it's been a few years since the days of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance and the Interwork Alliance as well. So very good to see you.
That's it. It's a lot long overdue, the catch up, and it's fun when we can share these with other people as well. And for that specific reason, the jump off point always with my guests is for them to talk about their own individual journeys with Web3 or blockchain, how they first learned about it, and how they ended up working in it full time on these various different cool initiatives they're doing. What was your own story, John?
So that's a very good question, by the way. My own story began back, I would say, mid 2000s when I was working on SOA strategy for Microsoft, Connor. I was one of the, I built the team that incubated SOA architectural principles and patterns. And so we did a lot of work in the early days on identity and master data management and workflow and orchestration. And I was at that time particularly obsessed with Ronald Coase and the theory of the firm, and how transaction costs may be mitigated or even obviated. And I was under the misapprehension that SOA would help me get there. And I realized much later that SOA was just technical plumbing, it's infrastructure, passive, it's just pipes. And so that awakening eventually led me to look for what I call economic platforms, truly economic platforms, where we could apply those principles from people like Coase and others to address truly transaction costs. And I would say that was the genesis, sort of being very successful and at the same time seeing sort of the fatal flaws of SOA led me to blockchain technologies, Connor.
And so Bitcoin, of course, was the first proper blockchain to emerge. But was it at that point that you got interested, or was it a bit further down the line when there's some other technology started to emerge?
So absolutely, yes. It was the early days of Bitcoin. In fact, I have some notes somewhere here that I wrote back in the day. I said, look, cryptocurrencies will be the future. However, to be very candid and to confess, I did not expect Bitcoin to be successful. I anticipated it to be an experiment. By who, I don't know yet. And so really, I saw it kind of as a vanguard more than kind of the juggernaut it's become since then. But for me, always, it was this notion of, platforms where we can embed crypto economic protocols, which in the history of computing, as you know very well, Connor, we've never had in the history of computing ever for 80, 90, 100 years or more, truly platforms that embody these economic principles. We have had mainframes, PCs, client server, SOA, as we discussed, cloud, but that's all just plumbing, isn't it?
And it's quite refreshing actually to hear someone say that when they first came across Bitcoin, they didn't really think it would it would amount to something, because the reason is so often people talk in terms of, I got into Bitcoin then this, and it's just this natural trajectory. But as someone who comes from a technology background, it was something that was just like this kind of open source project kind of with community around it. Yes, of course, we now know in hindsight, which is a wonderful thing, and so on and so forth. How it all went there. But with your kind of technologist hat, or because you were coming at it from a very pragmatic perspective, what were some of the things that you, if you can remember, you thought about it back then? Because of course, since your opinions changed, but I'm quite fascinated to hear about those early views on it, because it's I think there's some good insights to be had there.
No, it's a really good question, and I'm glad you asked him. It's a really I think it gets to the core of the topic, if you will. And again, just to be very candid, not to put any gloss over it. I mean, at that time, there was a bit of skepticism, and obviously, we had seen multiple waves of efforts at addressing sort of, obviously the double spend problem, and being able to have ledgers, and obviously the challenges therein in terms of so obviously there was a little bit of skepticism, and of course there was a little bit of surprising aha, saying, well, maybe, maybe they have really solved it this time. But there was never a sense that it was going to be the store of value. The focus, as you said, was always on the technology, right? How have we moved the bar, or the envelope in terms of what is possible and what is not? And just for context, back in the late 90s, I was living and working in the Valley, and we had seen sort of previous waves of efforts, Sham and others, and projects that people might have forgotten, like Cyber Gold, and all those efforts to do something along this. And so there's a little bit of jaded pessimism. At the same time, there was this sense of, perhaps this is the beginning of a new era. Uh, of course, at that time, I did not realize the possibilities of CBDCs down the line, and of course the specter, if you will, of what this entails, for us and others across the globe. But I would say, as a technologist, you're right. Just the aspect of, this is truly a new kind of platform, I think, is the big aha, the big takeaway for me from those days.
And at what point did your views start to kind of evolve? Because I'm sure at one level you'd seen that this idea of an economic platform that's baked into the protocol was very powerful, and no doubt there was a big idea that you took away from Bitcoin in that respect. But when did it move beyond that to actually really conjure up that belief that you said, right, I can see this is going to actually come together now. I want to jump into that and be a part of that future.
Yeah, really good question. And that was really the early days of Ethereum. And so I'm a platform guy. I've spent all my life building platforms and tools for developers. The tools I've built, have been used by millions, tens of millions of developers worldwide in terms of .NET and Azure. But for me, it was the early days of Ethereum, and the fact that, to put it very, very, very bluntly, that you could put a VM in there, and all of a sudden, what was a ledger became a platform. That was, at that time, I said, look, this is it. I want to spend the rest of my life working on this, because this is really, at this point, a platform. I'm a platform guy, right? On the flip side, working for a very large company for close to 2 decades, and seeing the challenges in terms of, for example, compliance, the billions of dollars spent on enterprise IT systems, on compliance and governance, and all of these sort of overlay, right? You have busloads of consultants, and still, at the end of the day, the so-called aligning IT in business, which was very fashionable for some time, has never really happened. And it couldn't happen because those platforms are not designed for that. But this blockchain platform intrinsically enables what you might call IT business alignment. And so at that time, I said, this is it. The next few decades are going to be about this and nothing else.
And definitely is in the next few decades as well, because it's a very big technological upheaval. I know that so many people rightfully are excited about it now, but we know as technologists that this stuff takes a long time to come to fruition.
Very true. Absolutely very true. And again, it's magical even right now, isn't it? But still, you're right. We haven't seen anything yet in terms of the possibilities. Because again, for me, driven by this notion of economic platforms, right? It's the socio-economic change, the potential to catalyze socio-economic change, to preserve, if you will, the sovereignty of the individual, to ensure that everybody every human being on this planet is able to put in and then get commensurate with what they put in, outputs. And again, all of this sort of algorithmically with crypto economic protocols being self-governed, self-regulated is just it's just an amazing time to be alive and working on this, isn't it, Connor?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But I think that's a very key point though as well that you raised there around the socio-economic aspect of it because there well, a lot of these technology platforms they're kind of restricted. There's certain barriers to using them, and there's always these silos that get built up over time. Be it within large corporations, or it could be just organisations that kind of own their chunk of the internet, and then people don't really have sovereignty on these platforms. It's very much so in their hands, and so it's something that has so much potential there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, since you mentioned it, back in the days when I was working on SOA and the early days of Azure before it became Azure, we led the incubation. There was this sort of technical philosophy, if you want to call it that way, that we termed fiefdoms and emissaries. Fiefdoms and emissaries in terms of technologies, technology platforms, and the challenges therein, right? And so that also, in some way, influenced my thinking around baking economic protocols into the stack as opposed to overlay, because the realization after about 18 years that overlay was always going to be an overlay and never really intrinsic into the capability, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. And we're still very much so in those early days because whilst in Web3 more broadly there are projects that are having great success with having the incentives sort of baked into the protocol, so to speak, or the way in which you transact with them. It's certainly not something that has kind of moved beyond the boundaries of these kind of pure Web3 projects. So I think where it could get very interesting, and I'm sure this is an area you've thought a lot about, is if there'll be an inflection point where enterprises or corporates or these more established companies see ways to create new monetization opportunities off the back of Web3. One of the examples that comes to mind, which I think is incredibly powerful, is say with royalty payments on NFTs, because like say in a game, right, if you have an NFT of an in-game item and then the publisher of that can get royalties in perpetuity for every time that exchanges hands. But I'm sure there's all these other things that you've been thinking about too along those sorts of lines.
Absolutely no, and this is a fun topic. This is a topic we could sort of dive into a lot. But if I may, just want to call a few things out in terms of your particular question. I would say first of all, platform shifts, as you have seen, right? The so-called Web 2 shift early on was challenging for many developers and even enterprises, corporations, because of this movement away around monetization to, as you said, to the consumer, to the customer, right? The customer became the product, and so we talk about aspects like surveillance capitalism and so on and so forth. And likewise, I think the so-called shift from Web 2 to Web 3 is once again, a pretty substantial shift in terms of what we call economic platforms. It's not easy to grok that. And certainly for people who've spent a long time in the traditional stack, it's not an easy transition. Now, with that said, I do want to call out that perhaps the term Web3 Connor might not really be the best term for us to use. And here is why, because I think of Web 2 as a bit of a cesspool. You look at social media, you look at the monetization, you look at the online censorship, you look at the customer is the product, right? And you look at obviously the level of surveillance. And so I wonder if maybe really we want to say we are building on the shoulders of Web 2 when Web 2 might not have been the best possible thing for the world. I rather prefer to think of Web 3 as a step back and then a pivot, if you will, around sovereignty of the individual. Sovereignty of the individual as being the primacy, if you will, and then everything entailing from that particular position. I would prefer to think of it as a complete shift in that way. Now, of course, VCs like the term Web3, it gives them legitimacy. Investors like something that is kind of, much better than maybe other terms that they don't want to use. So I can see kind of the politically correct aspects there. However, I think there is perhaps some thought around whether we really want to call this Web3. With that said, though, the shift in terms of developers is a substantial one. And this is where, for example, what we are doing, I'm doing building the developer tools for N3, right? When we began this journey, the realization, you know this very well, 2.5 years ago, the debugging smart contracts was pretty much non-existent. I mean, it's just it was a bit of a shame. And so we said, look, we know how to build these tools. We've built this before, for millions of developers worldwide. Let's build a developer experience comparable, if not better than that of Azure and Amazon Web Services. There are 20 plus million developers worldwide, Connor. 20 plus million. And so the crypto, the blockchain, people talk about 50,000, 100,000, 200. It's a drop in the ocean for us to truly say that we have done our job, right? Our bit. We got to step back and say, how do we really enable, these millions of developers to achieve, their objectives, to accomplish their mission, if you will. Now, on the NFT side, you made a very interesting point around NFTs and especially probably enterprises, corporations. It's very interesting. So I'll give you something to think about here. I believe that NFTs will fundamentally, completely reshape the enterprise sector. Here is why. Any any transaction, any contract, any multi-party artifact, any will become an NFT in the enterprise contract. So mortgages, loans, home sale, deeds, you buy a motorcycle, everything, right, will become an NFT. And I think we are underestimating what that will do in terms of the commercial slash enterprise market over the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, and one of the analogies which really resonated with me was this idea that with with Web3, the token is to Web3 what the website was to Web1, in terms of off the back of Web1, all these websites got created, and now there's billions of websites. And yeah, as you say, like we'll likely see the same thing with just tokens.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, like we said, as technologists, we know these things take time, so we haven't seen anything yet, haven't we?
Yeah, apart from all this rampant price speculation around NFTs, because I like to think once that cools down, people will hopefully start to see the genuine utility for them beyond these schemes where they make money through pumping
Even
up the
identity,
prices.
right? I mean, there's recently some discussion around soul-bound, tokens and identity, and I believe that the blockchain people are slowly getting to where enterprise people like I have been for the last 10, 15 years, which is really identity is the underpinning. And whether it's soul-bound tokens or something somewhat similar, NFTs will first of all destroy the existing identity and access management market and rebuild it. And for good reason, because we have to go back to the self-sovereignty of the individual and their identity, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, yeah. But bizarrely as well, though, with all of this, there is still a huge opportunity for enterprises in terms of issuing credentials or the facts about people. Like if you've already banking with a specific bank, that bank's in a position to issue you a credential that you own to say, yeah, John's been a loyal customer of this bank for this many years, which in itself is a massive opportunity for these enterprises. So it's not like the future's bleak for them. They've still got huge opportunities, but it seems like they're kind of slower to recognize that opportunity.
Very true, very true. And again, this is not unlike, for example, the points, right? Or, that enterprises have been enabling for a long time. But you're right, that bridge to saying, customer loyalty, customer retention, right? Customer nurture, if you want to call it, is going to be a very significant theme around NFTs. And you're absolutely correct.
And so there's clearly a lot of work that needs to be done around the sovereignty aspect of things with regards to not only giving access to these whether we're going to call them blockchain or these improved Web2 networks. But are there any other? And you've mentioned developer tools as well. But are there other sort of big building blocks that you feel are missing from it all?
Yes, certainly, Connor. I think so. You're a patterns guy. I know you love design patterns. I know you've done a lot of work over the years on design patterns. I think from an architecture perspective, Connor, enterprise architecture has been around for some time. Back into the days of John Zachman and others in the 70s, right? I believe and I say we, people like you, we need to redefine economic enterprise architectures, Connor, because the previous wave, right? Again, back to TOGAF and EAF and Zachman and others. You had all these sort of claims and dimensions, but there was never an economic dimension. And so to truly enable this next wave, yes, you're right, developer tools, you know, but architectural patterns, models that instantiate the economic dimension in the forefront, I think is sorely lacking. That's going to be a hard one to shift, though, because once again, as we said, if you've been sort of deep into the passive plumbing architectural models, this is quite a big shift into the so-called Web3 architecture patterns.
Do you feel that that's one of the barriers as well, facing a lot, onboarding a lot of these new folk into Web3?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely, because it's such an alien concept, right? You talk about traditional enterprise architecture. You talk about, you can talk about the physical and sort of the logical. You can talk about the conceptual. You can talk about, business layer and information and application layers and technology layers. But for 40, 50 years, uh, we have never had to discuss the economic layer, right? Never. It was something that was kind of outside of technology, outside IT, and maybe it was something that the executive team or the board were able to handle. But now with economic platforms, the architectures themselves are economic architectures, Connor. And so this means that the architects have to be savvy enough, have to grok and have to be able to understand the trade-offs and the implications. And if they don't, then what happens is we see basically they use blockchains as databases, and then they come back and say, well, John, this isn't doing anything for me. And my point is, yes, it isn't doing anything for you because you're not really using it as an economic platform, using it as a database. Right? So this economic architecture patterns, Connor, I think is fundamental. Now, how we get there, I don't know yet, but it will happen over the next, 2, 3, 4 years.
Yes, it certainly has some interesting ramifications as well. You think about within the structure of any organization, you might have your salespeople who are going out winning a lot of the business, and then you've got your, whether it's PMs involved in the process, your business analysts, or your product focused people, and then the actual developers. Now, if a developer manages to do something that somehow can hit a home run in a public market, and there's a clear revenue associated with that, it becomes a lot easier to kind of say, hey, that was me, or potentially put a stake in the ground for their piece of the pie, than has historically been the case, where this stuff tends to be almost abstracted away a bit in terms of the complexities of the organization, and
Yes,
people
yes.
taking their slices out before it kind of goes all the way down to the bottom rung, where you've got the people on the front line doing the code.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, you're right. You put the nail on the head right there, and this shift in terms of developers, in terms of architects and architectures, right? And so we're gonna have to see sort of a new wave of leadership with respect to exploiting, economic platforms. And of course, as I said earlier, if we ignore that economic layer or the economic dimension, then what do you have? You have basically a database, possibly decentralized at best, but a database.
And so, just moving back as well to, in terms of your own, I guess, journey again. I know that now you work with Neo on the enterprise side of things. What was it that brought you into the fold there in terms of really? Well, why Neo? And I think it's worth painting a picture in terms of the other different platforms and blockchains out there as well.
No, certainly, yeah. I mean, the foray into the Neo into the N3 ecosystem, people may or may not know, but Neo is built on .NET, Connor, the common language runtime. And so for me, having worked on the architecture of .NET back in the early days, early 2000s, even before it was called .NET, there was just a fascination. There was just an interest and kind of the possibility, the potential to take what I had built for the traditional enterprise world and now have another opportunity to build the entire developer stack for an architecture built on the very same runtime, a polyglot runtime, being able to enable developers, all shapes and sizes. One of the challenges that I saw early on, obviously, was, and again, not to be to be polite here, but the aspect of specific languages or specific frameworks. That to me was a reflection of perhaps the fact that the people who built the early stacks had not built developer platforms earlier. And so, whereas I came from having built dev platforms for multiple decades, and so the opportunity to enable a truly polyglot dev stack, you like Python, you like Go, you like C Sharp, you like Java, JavaScript, and being able to elevate that and say, come as you are, and build smart contracts in the language you like, debug them in the way you are used to and have been familiar with on Azure and .NET for a very long time. And to scale it was just an incredible opportunity. And that was really the motivation to step in. And so looking at the architecture was unique and still is unique. I don't think we have that level of, I would say again, not to beat the drum, but I believe we have built the premier developer stack and tools in the industry, bar none. Of course, the game is very early. People like to call winners and losers. I certainly believe in this space there are no winners and losers. I think it's about contributing to a greater, if you will, outcome for all of us together. But certainly, me and my team, we've built a dev platform that is comparable to Amazon Web Services, to Azure, if not superior. And we are building again, on top of it. We are still innovating. As I see again, like I said, 20 plus million developers, and how many do we have on the blockchain stack? A very small number, right? Very small number. But we know how it goes, right? Early days of cloud, I remember. I mean, people were saying, "Look, it's just storage, it's just compute, it's just archival and backup," and see where we are. 15 years later. And so I see obviously the movie. The way I tell people is, the trailer is playing in the theater, but the movie is not there yet, right? And looking at the trailer, it's hard to say, is this a successful, domain or industry or not, because it's just the trailer.
And at what point will those will we actually get the movies? Do you think?
Absolutely. And I think that the shift is going to come in terms of the broader, the macro, global, socioeconomic affairs, if you will. I think we are hitting a very, very pivotal point with respect to sovereignty of the individual, of the state, and the trade offs therein between how we approach humanity's future. So I believe the timing is right. So one thing, and maybe I'll segue a little bit. One of the things that I learned, and in fact, I learned this from a very good friend of mine, building Azure in the early days, before it was called Azure, is that when technology trends, economic trends, and social trends intersect, magic happens. We've seen multiple waves of this, Connor. Sometimes technology leads and you see kind of this big pop in terms of buzz, and sometimes social trends lead. But however, when technology, economics, and social trends intersect, that's when truly the magic happens in terms of the impact. And I believe we are very close to that point in time right now. And it couldn't have been designed better in terms of creating socioeconomic change, in my opinion.
And then thinking about this kind of triangle, so to speak, it's just yeah, it's a good way of positioning it. But I mean, no doubt there's parallels as well with some of the earlier web in terms of probably not the as much with the initial web, but when you started having, well, whether it's like freelance type platforms or platforms that enable people in any corner of the world in effect to do work for someone else. So yes, it's not always perfect, but at the same time it's created a lot of new opportunities for that. And then there's people who've created new businesses online because of the connectivity. So I guess we've already had some
Yes, yes,
phases of this previously with the evolution of the web and internet connectivity and iPhone, well, phone, mobile and so on. But yeah, as you say, this
absolutely.
is kind of, yeah, it's this next big one that's on the
If
horizon.
I may say, you're right. Remember the phrase "the long tail," Connor. And at this point, it's kind of maybe a little bit passé. But remember the phrase "long tail," right? Long tail was also a bit of a convergence, if you will, between social, economic, and technology trends. But again, you're right. This notion of the long tail, which in some sense today is kind of forgotten or passé. But again, that was a point in time when social trends. economic trends, and as you said, the early days in terms of web technology came together in very profound ways, right? To drive change. And it didn't matter where you lived or where you worked or which country you were a citizen of or which, domain, but you were able to contribute and benefit from it. And you're right, the same way today, I think we are seeing a very interesting confluence in terms of these three dimensions. So keep those in mind. It's a troika of sorts, right? And once we learned it, we can have applied this to almost every aspect to see, well, is this just about technology, or is it really about driving change at scale?
And it's still such a fascinating time because you have just people from so many different backgrounds getting involved in Web3, and
Yes.
I'm sure you would have felt the same when you first kind of moved out of the world of Microsoft into this world, and you went to your first Web3 conference, and you're suddenly like, this is a very different crowd to what I'm used
Yes,
to.
absolutely. Yes. Kind of again, once again from the grassroots, from the ground up, right? Not having any kind of top down. Of course, things have changed since then, I think, but I'm sure you recollect back in the early days as well in terms of this purely, if you will, grassroots innovation coming from uh, the bottom of the pyramid, so to say, rather than from the top.
And so, some of the other areas around just the Web3 landscape more broadly, and a topic that comes up a fair bit is decentralization. And I know that this is something that you have some strong views on.
Certainly, I do. In fact, I think strong is probably an understatement. You're right, and thank you for asking me. My sense is that perhaps words have connotations. Words have significant connotations in terms of not just the vocabulary, but the thought process and the manifestation. And so I have to ask and say, were we really focused on the right theme when we talk about decentralization? Two things, in practical terms, we across the industry, across the landscape, right? We see the reality is that it's not really decentralized. Yeah, there's degrees of decentralization. And when I talk to people, they say, oh, John, look, it hasn't been done right. It hasn't been enough decentralization. And to me that's like people say, well, communism has not been done right. Just give it one more chance here, and when it'll happen again, this time it'll be right this time, right? But frankly, I think the thesis, the focus corner, ought to be on the outcomes. Decentralization is a means to an end, right? And so I believe we have been distracted, possibly led astray by this focus on the means, not the end. So, what do I mean by the end, by the outcome? I think it's self governance, self regulation, self sovereignty. That's what I believe we want for the individuals, for the citizens, for the taxpayers' sovereignty, for the systems themselves, self regulation, self governing, being able to evolve. And whether that happens in terms of decentralization, in terms of machine learning algorithms, in terms of crypto economic protocols coming together, possibly, right? So, and I think this is where we are still in some sense kind of led astray by the venture capitalists, in terms of let's look at this particular chain, see how many nodes it has, and frankly the nodes may go back to the same treasure chest at the end of the day, right? So I strongly believe that we need to go back and ask ourselves, what is really the end game? What is the outcome? The outcome cannot be a technical term like centralization or decentralization. That's for geeks to play with, right? But in terms of the socio-economic outcomes, self-sovereignty, self-governance, self-regulation, being able to design these systems that can evolve, right? That's really, I think, where we ought to focus on and ask ourselves, are we distracted? Are we spending time, energy, focus on a theme that perhaps really only serves the interests of venture capitalists and investors, possibly?
It's definitely a key point around the outcomes. I would say as well, though, in terms of the decentralization, ultimately you need these platforms to be decentralized enough that someone who is using them for their self sovereignty is not living in fear of it being shut down because there's one or two organizations that exert too much power and control over the whole network there. Like as we saw with Tornado Cash being
Yes,
sanctioned,
yes.
it's like it's still there, it's still available. Of course, a lot of people are blacklisting the services, and they're choosing to do that, but there's an element of choice that goes with that, and so people, yeah, if they are relying on a specific network to be there for some of these self, well, these their, whether it's some credentials or information about themselves, they know whatever happens, it's always going to be there, which I think is quite an
True, true.
important outcome.
True. But if I may, if I just want to quickly maybe just give you a follow on, two things I would say is that, when we talk about decentralization, from what perspective, from what dimension, from what vantage point? Is it about, like you said, nodes? Is it about, the teams, the developers, the tokens, the token holders, right? I think that's also another dimension of how perhaps we ought to be much more careful. And secondly, I would say, in many sense, decentralized governance, the emperor has no clothes, right? There is no decentralized governance. I mean, truly, and to be very candid, the emperor has no clothes. So let's not kid ourselves that in some sense we have kind of solved this. We have not, right? We have attempts. And so trying to put sort of this term, this phrase, and people who don't perhaps understand the intricacies, maybe misled. And I want to just call it very clearly and say, look, we're not there. Even DAOs, for example, right? I think it's a brilliant concept, brilliant, absolutely. And I believe this has the potential to change how we think in terms of organizations at the core. However, the governance of DAOs is still very much an open topic, in my opinion.
Yeah, I read a tweet recently about how if you start a DAO community, you're kind of stuck with it. You can't walk away from it. It's not like a job where you can take it and then move on. Someone else can come in. You're kind of you're there for the long run. But on the decentralization side of things, a term that I've heard come up in the context of DeFi, which maybe is an in my mind, a way of thinking about it is protocol solvency, because that hopefully paints more of a picture around, is this going to be there for what I need it to? And there's all these, as you say, all these multiple dimensions or lenses through which it can be viewed as the decentralization. But the fundamental question really is that you want this to be solvent, whatever happens.
It's a very good point, and I'm very glad you mentioned it. You're right, because when you go back and look at nature, right? You look at nature and you look at biology and cell biology. You look at genetics and epigenetics. You look at, for example, the starfish, and how the starfish is able to survive, to sustain and to grow and evolve, even when there is a loss of perhaps one or more aspects or limbs, right? And I think you're absolutely right around the future of these systems. So this again for me, and maybe I'm flogging the horse here, but this to me goes back to self-regulation, self-governance, self-sustaining, and how we design these systems to be able to, like I said, to survive over time, which may or may not necessarily have to do with decentralization, because like we talked about in terms of policy, and I serve on the board of the Global Blockchain Business Council. There is always going to be this, this how do we say it? This debate, this dilemma, this dichotomy, this sort of friction between centralized and decentralized. And so, trying to sort of push this theme is always going to get these policymakers riled up because, frankly, they don't like it. Right? It's just a fact. And so, right, I was going to say, on one side, clearly the term I don't think is serving the community, as you said, sustainability, longevity. How you sort of evaluate an architecture is the longevity. You travel in Europe, you look at the cathedrals, you look at the libraries, they've been around for centuries. And so the architecture is sustainable, it's evolvable, right? It survives. And so you're right, it's about the protocol longevity of the protocol. At the same time, the words I think have very significant connotations, and so also drive the philosophical, the socio-cultural aspects of the community. And that's why I want to just throw my 2 cents and say, let's ask ourselves, what is the outcome? And not necessarily what is the means, or what may or may not be the means to get there.
And there's the reality, especially when you're dealing with consumer offerings, that all too often they don't care about what's behind the scenes.
Precisely.
I, I,
Precisely.
I believe that the world, the majority of the world's crypto holders actually hold crypto on Binance. You know, it's and so it's things like this which, yeah, there's an uphill battle to still to be fought on it all.
Precisely. You said it beautifully, Kun. I love what you said. You're right. The consumer, the individual, doesn't care about all this mumbo jumbo, right? He or she is focused on the outcomes, right? What they want to, what they perceive as value for themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely. So outside of the, I guess the sovereignty, the self governance of the Web3 and blockchain protocols facilitate, are there other kind of bigger picture areas that you're really interested in or passionate about with respect to Web3?
Certainly. It's one thing I want to maybe highlight for you. And again, because I come from the more traditional enterprise software world, if you will, and I think you have sort of one foot on both sides as well. I want to just sort of maybe throw an idea for you and for your audience. In a world that is decentralized or self-governing, self-regulating, self-sustaining, perhaps, uh, everything is a claim. And when I say everything, I mean everything, everything, right? And this is why we have consensus. The need for consensus is to verify, to validate claims and say, yeah, this is in fact something we believe in. This is consensus. And so, as we talk about metaverses and this shift, this evolution from where we are to what may be tomorrow, I want to emphasize that we're going to more and more face this challenge that claims are going to dominate the metaverse, the digital universes. And so, how do we, as an industry, how do we, as developers, enable, build the infrastructure to verify, to validate, to ensure that the claims can actually be, validated? This, to me, is a fundamental issue that I believe we have not yet, put enough time, focus, and energy, right? And surprises me because so much time has been spent on consensus. And why consensus? Because the claims need to be validated, right? And so if you make that shift in terms of digital metaverses, everything is a claim. Identity is a claim. A transaction is a claim. A contract is a claim. A deed is a claim. And so how are we going to address this is something that I lose a lot of sleep over. And this to me is fascinating, Connor, because we have to really understand what the implications of this are, and how do we enable this? Because everything is a claim. Think about it. Everything.
So let's unpack it with an example there, just to talk through like your thinking around it too, in terms of where we are and where we need to get to, just to help solidify it. And so if we take is it better to talk in terms of like a metaverse example or just in terms of a real world thing where we have a digital twin?
Well, we could talk about either. We could talk about, for example, we could talk about oracles and blockchains, right? Why do we have oracles? Because we need to look at these claims and say, well, is this claim backed up by whatever? Right? So absolutely. I mean, we can go any direction you like, but personally, I tend to think more about the metaverses because I think this is a space that is rapidly accelerating, both in terms of consumer. We see the Facebooks of the world. On the enterprise side, we see the Microsofts and others of that ilk, investing, building, and I think the fact that you're going to have these universes digital with all these claims packed in, and what is the mechanism, the technology mechanism, the social mechanisms, and the economic fabric to ensure that these claims can actually be uh, verified, even if verify is even the right word for it.
So to, I guess, to unpack a real world example, supply chains being a great one, right? So you have some freight that comes into a port, and someone allegedly inspects that crate has is present and it hasn't been tampered with. They sign a document and then that goes on, and so they're making a claim there. And I guess in the real world it's like it's that idea of how do you ensure that that actor is being 100% honest. And so it's really any time something is going from a real world action into the digital realm, where once it hits the digital realm it can't be tampered with, but there's still that kind of gap there.
Precisely.
in the metaverse type example, which how does that work? Because I think that might be slightly harder for people to understand.
Yeah, I'll just go back to so by the way, your example is brilliant. It's spot on, right? In terms of if it is purely digital, it has no basis in, let's say, the analog real world, then of course, all bets are off, right? It's self-contained within the digital universe, the metaverse, if you will. However, if there is some element of bridging, of connecting back one way or two ways, then that's where things get very interesting. And for me, the most simplest, the fundamental example, Connor, is identity, right? And of course, we have personas and avatars, and all of this, of course, that's a given. But if you're going to participate in activities, transactions, contracts that have legal, economic, social implications, then how do we ensure that identities are in fact who they say they are, right? And this is a fundamental issue, because if we don't get a good handle on this, then the entire basis of any kind of economic activity in these metaverses will be at risk, right? So in terms of blockchain systems, we talk about identity, we talk about Oracle infrastructure, and being able to say, look, can we verify, can we validate? And of course, on the flip side, then you have staking and slashing, right? You're going to have some economic architectures to ensure that the basis for this verification or this validation, is sustainable. Otherwise, it's a free lunch, and we know there is no such thing as a free lunch, right? So beginning with identity, then of course building on top of it, like I said, transactions, deeds, contracts. It's easy to say if it's purely digital, that's one thing. But in this case, I think we're discussing about this bridge, because we are still going to be bridging for quite some time, And so, how do we ensure? Uh, Easy, I think, for people to say, well, it's a metaverse, and so I will not worry about what is out there in the real world. Fine, but then it becomes a playverse, right? You can play. It's a gaming universe at that point in time. However, if we really want to enable this, the socioeconomic shift, and again, I go back to very simple, like I said, identity. We don't have a good handle on it. We can discuss, soul bound and self sovereign, but those are all technical details, right? This is all, it's like talking about OAuth and OAuth 2 and, claims based, and, we'll use SSO. Sure, that's all technical details, but how do we ensure that this claim that you say you're Connor, I say and John, you know, if it has legal implications, right? How do we ensure? We haven't thought through. This to me is a fundamental topic that I would love to come back and talk with you again, maybe in a year or two as we make more progress.
That's it. Hopefully there will be. Yeah, you got me thinking about this idea where you've got like Elon Musk's Neuralink, so where people's like brains are connected probably to their VR devices in the metaverse, and you've still got that point of contention between where the neural pathway is actually hooked into this device before it actually goes from the
Yes,
real world to the digital.
yes. And eventually you can say maybe it doesn't matter because we'll all shift to the metaverse possibly. But again, I don't want to think that far ahead. But in the meantime, we have this very practical topic of bridging, right? And maybe two ways. And so, how do we do that? I think that's going to be a fundamental challenge for this industry over the next few years, Connor.
No, absolutely, absolutely. If we were though to go a bit further forward, just 10 years into the future, how do you believe that Web3 will have manifested itself at that point?
That's a that's a very interesting question. It's also a very dangerous question, I think. No, thank you. When I say dangerous, what I mean is because I see these as economic platforms, and because I see the outcomes as socio-economic outcomes. I think when we look that far ahead, 10 years, the constraints that we have imposed on ourselves as a society, as a culture, as nation states, I think those constraints potentially might uh, might be obviated. And therein lies the big challenge, the big opportunity, and the big risk as well, because it could be a fundamental shift of how we organize ourselves as human beings, of how we come together for our benefit, not for somebody else's benefit. I see future organizational artifacts really evolving from this shift. And again, all because of the intrinsic socioeconomic protocols baked into these architectures. Economic architectures are the future across multiple dimensions, as we discussed earlier. And so, looking out 10 years, I think if we are able to follow through, it's a big if we are able to follow through on these platforms that we have today, I certainly believe that we as human beings will have made a huge leap forward in terms of serving us and our our fellow human beings, brothers and sisters, in a good way, in a positive way, in a human way. But the downside, of course, is these technologies can be maybe used for surveillance, maybe used for destroying privacy, maybe used for completely obviating any sense of what it means, to have sovereignty. That's the flip side of it, right? It's a bit of a Gordian knot, if we will. And so the right or wrong person being able to cut the Gordian knot might unleash who knows what kind of possibilities. And that's kind of the flip side of it, if you will.
I think we should stick to the other side of the coin because it's a nice place for us to wrap up as well, like a good sort of optimistic vision for the future with it all.
Thank you.
So
Thank
so
you.
so John, if people want to I guess follow you or reach out to you, what social channels are you active on, if any?
Certainly, thank you. And again, follow isn't a term I appreciate, but certainly if you want to reach out to me, if you want to discuss, debate, ask questions, ping me on Twitter, ping me on LinkedIn, or just send me email, john@devados.net. I'm very happy to follow up. There are many ideas. I would love to debate, discuss. I love ideas and I love discussing ideas with people. So certainly very open if there is interest. Thank you.
Web3 is definitely a great place to be for discussing ideas as well, given all of the uncertainty that we have there. John, it's been an absolute pleasure to catch up and also to chat and be able to share your thinking and ideas with a wider audience. And yeah, look forward to catching up again soon.
Likewise. Thank you, Conor. Thank you for giving me your time. It's very good to catch up. It's been a long time, and I appreciate the back and forth and look forward to catching up again. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Hi, it's Conor Svensson here again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm really excited to share with you that I've written a book, The Blockchain Innovators Handbook, a leader's guide to understanding, adopting, and succeeding with this disruptive technology. I've been wanting to share my learnings about blockchain and Web3 for a number of years with a wider audience, and I'm really excited that I can do this now. This book covers everything from the fundamentals of the technology through to opportunity identification and implementation for your business to ensure that you can be one of the big beneficiaries of the wider transition to Web3 that's taking place now. The book is available in physical as well as digital form. For more information, head to web3labs.com/innovators.